Welcome to Love Thy Lawyer, where we talk to practicing attorneys and the occasional judge about their lives and careers. I'm Louis Goodman. Today, it's my privilege to welcome the Honorable Michelle Tong to the podcast. Judge Tong serves on the San Francisco Superior Court. Before her election to the bench, Judge Tong worked as a trial attorney for the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. There, she tried more than 50 cases to jury verdict and handled hundreds of litigated preliminary hearings and motions. Judge Michelle Tong, welcome, Your Honor, to Love Thy Lawyer.
Thank you, Louis, for having me on your podcast.
Well, thank you for being here. Where are you talking to us from right now?
I am in my home in San Francisco, and one of my favorite art pieces is in the background.
Well, unfortunately for the podcast, we are not going to be able to see your favorite art piece, but I can see it in looking at the screen. Tell us what sort of department you're handling right now.
So I've been on the bench now for, it will be 2 years this coming January, 2020, what is that, 3? So I have been assigned to the small claims division in San Francisco. I have had 2 stints in filling in with the civil harassment calendar / default judgment calendar for a few weeks over the past summer. And actually, right this week, I am also had a day full of civil harassment restraining order requests today.
Well, it sounds like it must keep you busy and rather occupied.
It's very busy. Both calendars are rather busy, yes. Dealing with a lot of self-represented litigants.
Where are you from originally?
I was born in Toronto, well, actually a small town outside of Toronto, Canada. I learned it was about 5 or 8 hours outside of Toronto, Canada. And then we ended up moving to Toronto until I was around 8. And then I moved to Sacramento, California with my folks. And that's where I was raised. My parents are still there. Ethnically, I'm Chinese American or Chinese Canadian. My parents are both immigrant Chinese from mainland China, but they also were pretty much raised in Hong Kong. I think they also consider themselves HKers is what I call them, Hong Kong.
So you went to high school in Sacramento?
I did.
What high school did you go to?
I went to 2 high schools. For the first 2 years, I went to C.K. McClatchy High School, and then I ended up graduating from John F. Kennedy High School.
In Sac?
In Sacramento, South Sac.
And when you graduated from high school, where'd you go to college?
I went to UC Santa Cruz. I am a alumni slug.
So how was your experience in Santa Cruz? What did you do there?
It was great. I loved it in a sense where, really it was an environment that sort of fostered that age to learn and figure out who you are, at least in terms of leaving the house and just being open to progressive politics and liberal ideas, et cetera, that might be very different than how I was raised or how other kids were raised. It's a beautiful campus. And I, kind of had a little experience of everything throughout the years. I lived in the dorms, lived on campus apartments, lived off campus. I studied abroad in China for 6 months.
Let's talk about that a little bit,
Yeah.
Studying abroad in China. I mean,
Yeah.
What was that like going to China to study, being ethnic Chinese, but being clearly a very North American kid?
Oh, yes. That was a definite culture. When we say culture shock, it's beyond culture shock, right? It's like I always grown up being Chinese, and yet mainland Chinese, because I studied in mainland China, they didn't see me as Chinese. And this identity struggle was understanding what being Chinese means. And obviously, as a young person, you don't have the maturity and the exposure and the experience to sort of grapple with that. And it can be emotionally hard for someone to always be tested and challenged as to whether you really are Chinese. And I know I'm not the only ethnic group that goes through that, but that was something that I did experience.
Do you speak any Mandarin or Cantonese?
So my family speaks Cantonese. So that's what I was raised being familiar with. That is my familiar second language is Cantonese. but I did learn Mandarin from my studies abroad. I generally say I speak both poorly, but I can, I definitely have an accent, so people, depending on who the listener is, they either appreciate my efforts or maybe it's too hard for them to hear it. I think by and large, most native Cantonese or Mandarin speakers, I think they appreciate the effort.
Where did you live in China when you were there, and how long were you there?
So I was there for 6 months, and I studied in a city called Tianjin, Tianjin, which is 2 hours away from Beijing, which is in a considered central northern China.
And that's a Mandarin-speaking area, is that correct?
It is a Mandarin-speaking city. And I mean, that's what I was going there, is just to learn Mandarin.
How did you feel when you got back?
I will never forget this. The first movie I saw, and for the 6 months I did spend, during the summer and the winter session, I went to Hong Kong, and which was another shock, going from China to a very developed Asian country or society. But when I came back, the first movie I saw, I'll never forget, was Pulp Fiction. And I was, to this day, I will never forget. I was horrified. I was horrified at the cinematography and the violence. And everyone was, had been out at least some time prior to my watching it, and everyone was saying how great it was, and it was receiving all these positive awards and reviews. And I was like, what is going on in America? So, I did have to reacclimate to, again, the culture and what makes America, for good or for bad, great, right? Just the immersion and the coalescing of so many different kinds of people that live in this one place together, and how different people navigate those issues.
Yeah, and I think that when you come from a fairly conservative society where you were living for 6 months in China, and then all of a sudden you get reintroduced to America in all of its Americanness, it's a bit of a shock. It's a bit of a culture shock.
Right. And it also shifted. It was pivotal in a sense where it shifted. It completely changed the trajectory of what kind of work I wanted to, because prior, when I went to China, one of the things at the time, foreign investments was, and it's always been an issue, or not an issue, but it's always been a part of our economic, global society. But at the time, investing in China was really starting to come to head with, Motorola was going there and things like that. And I thought that I could use my bicultural life and help companies, for example, in Asia or China. And I realized when I came, I said, you know what? I'm an American, or, I'm here. And I felt, if anything, I want to use my bicultural life and help people here in the States rather than foreign companies in China make more money per se. So it really shifted what I wanted to do with my life, basically.
Is that when you started thinking about becoming a lawyer and going to law school?
No. What I did, though, is I started working with immigrant populations in Sacramento, or not Sacramento, but in college. It's where I started to look for those communities. But it wasn't until at one of the places, Asian Law Alliance, which I did an externship in San Jose when I was in Santa Cruz. And I saw, and I thought I would just do nonprofit work and be a poor public servant. And I saw lawyers. I just didn't even know really what lawyers were. And I saw these people that were lawyers doing community work. And I thought, well, this is cool. It's kind of like marrying some sort of profession with helping the community. And that's when I started thinking about law school.
So it was that experience of working with those community groups and meeting some lawyers who were actually practicing that got you thinking about, hey, I could do that. I'd like to be a lawyer. I think I could have a more positive effect as an attorney than just as a, social worker, community organizer, helper.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And so how far along were you in your education at that point?
it was probably towards the end, like my last semester, last quarter, that I did this externship at the Asian Law Alliance my senior year of college.
And then when you graduated from Santa Cruz, you ultimately went to law school. Did you take any time off between graduating from Santa Cruz and going to law school, or did you just go straight through?
I did. I took 2 years off, and in the 2 years, I actually continued to work doing public interest work at kind of like this a sister-related nonprofit. It's the oldest Asian public interest agency. It's called the Asian Law Caucus there in San Francisco. And I actually segued nicely into doing an internship with the caucus. So I ended up being like a community advocate paralegal for 2 years. I did immigration work, employment labor work, and then I applied for law school. I got in the first year after the first year, and I decided to defer another year and ended up taking 2 off.
Where did you go to law school?
I went to UOP McGeorge.
Oh, McDuck.
Yes, in Sacramento, yes.
So you
moved home.
Yeah, kind of a return back to Sacramento.
It was.
And how was your experience in law school?
Pretty unpleasant.
Why?
I'd say I felt like I wasn't kind of informed or told as to like the actual day-to-day, like what law school is about. Like I knew I was fortunate enough to be introduced to a lot of lawyers because I worked with lawyers for 2 years. And, the classic lawyer just bemoans law school and hates it. And it just was a hard struggle for me. I didn't have cable when I was living on my own, and my parents had cable. And I'm a big baseball fan, and they had all these baseball games. And I just didn't understand, like, what's the homework for law school? So it was hard. And I would say maybe by the third year when I finally it took me a little while, and I finally started to get it and was able to take classes that were more of an interest to me. And I really enjoyed my criminal procedure classes and evidence. I really liked those classes. Then, it became better.
Okay. So you graduated from McGeorge, and you ultimately went to the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. What was the path from McGeorge to San Francisco Public Defender?
I returned to the Bay Area, worked at the caucus, and I also interned at the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. And let me say this, I ultimately ended up going to law school because I wanted to be a public defender. I had experience with immigration law, and at the time there were huge changes with immigration law where immigrants who had been previously convicted of a crime but were not citizens were getting deported and placed in immigration detention. And that was during 1996. So these two worlds were just colliding. And back then we didn't have the word now. It's called crimmigration. Mm-hmm. And so I had the immigration knowledge. I had visioned going to law school to be a public defender, and then I would come out and do crimmigration. So I was at the San Francisco Public Defender's Office, and with that goal, I was interning at other public defender's offices, the Federal Public Defender in Sacramento, Eastern District. And then I graduated, and what ended up happening is I came back to the Bay Area and I did eviction defense work. I was helping pro se tenants that were being faced with evictions. And then I ended up going to the public defender's office in San Francisco as a paralegal, again, for a few years. And then I started practicing, and I'd been a lawyer there for about 15 years before I ran for judge.
And in those 15 years, you tried a lot of cases, you represented a lot of individuals charged with very serious crimes. What did you think about practicing law?
Oh, I loved it. I mean, I would tell people all the time that, you hear athletes and other people that really love their job saying that they can't believe they're getting paid to do the work that they do. And that's how I felt as a public defender. I get paid relatively well, in a sense where I can support myself. to do work that I believe in and that I love. So I loved it.
If a young person was considering a career, would you recommend the law?
Yes, depending on what they like to do. I have young people that either have an interest to talk and will talk to me. And there's young people that I meet that, there's something in them that you think are good qualities and traits to being a lawyer. And I'll raise that with them. I actually still trying to convince one of my nephew's really good friends that he should be a lawyer. I could just see it in him. He's not motivated at the time right now, but.
What sort of traits do you look for?
Observant, quick, but you could tell they're also processing and they're thinking and they're observing, articulate. They don't talk like they have marbles in their mouth. Yeah, they'll share things and observations and perspectives that seem to have some depth and seem to be able to contextualize the things that they're experiencing and what they observe. I like those kinds of traits. And I'm not saying that those aren't good qualities for, a librarian, a doctor, whatever the case may be. But those are the traits that I see in good lawyering and a good trial attorney.
What prompted you to start thinking about a judicial career?
It's interesting. I don't know if there was any one particular thing. And I'll say that it's not something I ever envisioned. And that's something that I didn't think could be a place for me, being that I went to law school to be a public defender and be an advocate and do social justice work. But a variety of things happened, such as, over the years, you see appointments, you see people that are running or become judges. And again, you're in your office and you're just bemoaning this person and this new judge and this new judge. And are they a good judge or a bad judge? And they're constantly disappointing. And there's an opportunity that arose in which there was an open seat. And that's also at the time, there's a lot of changes going on at the public defender's office. Our fearless leader had suddenly passed away, Jeff Adachi. And there's opportunity that came up with an open seat. And the thought that instead of looking and again, envisioning, oh my gosh, here's another new judge or there's another new judge and we'll come back to the office and we're just complaining. It's like, you know what? Why keep looking around to see what someone else is going to do about it? And why don't you do something about it, Michelle? It's like the shift of Jeff leaving, who always believed in people getting involved in the political process and putting their hat in the ring. And it's just the same adage of people complaining about politics and not getting involved or whatever the process is, right? Get involved. And that's what I decided to do.
What did you think about running for judge? I ran for judge, by the way, so I know something about it. So I'm super curious about what you thought of the process of running for judge.
Well, the process to run for judge, which I'm sure you know, requires a complete evaluation of how the whole campaign period will look like and unfold. And can you see it from beginning to end, just like a trial, right? Just like any commitment you make. I'd spent over 20 years in my community. I had relationships with people, even though we weren't in touch. I knew that I could reach out to them and say, look, I'm running for judge. I need your support. No problem.
What did you think about raising money?
That was very difficult. I was very bad at it. I was very bad at it. And yet I managed. I'm not saying I didn't have to use, my own resources and as well as I had family that helped me out, but I was able to raise a substantial amount.
Yeah, because it takes a lot of money to run for any office.
And I didn't do call time very well. I had generous supporters. And for that, I'll always be thankful.
Yeah. How does being a judge either meet or differ from your expectations about it?
So that's funny. When I started becoming a judge, and I still have these thoughts now, I felt the same way that I felt when I was telling you about law school. It's like, a lot of judges, and you see judges all the time. But it's like they don't tell you these certain things, and maybe it's because they're not thinking about it. So I were to tell someone that wants to be a judge, I would explain these things. I call me naive, but the amount of mediating and problem solving, I just completely underestimated. You're like the legal therapist. I've told that to some of my litigants. One side's coming to you for a problem, the other one comes to you about a problem. They have a different interpretation of the problem, right? Emotionally, legally, intellectually, and you're there to ferret out to both people's unhappiness and solve it. And I just completely underestimated that.
I've mentioned this before on the podcast, which is that I haven't had the kind of judicial experience that you have, but I've sat pro tem a fair amount, mainly in traffic courts. And as much as I've been in court, and I've been in court every professional day of my life, when you walk out on that bench and you look at the courtroom from that perspective, it is a different and scary viewpoint, I think. And I'm wondering what you think.
It is a different viewpoint in the sense where, and this was another thing that I had to sort of come to terms with, or another reality check, so to speak. I spent so much of my career working hard to build a professional reputation amongst the judges that I appeared in front of, my clients, colleagues, the opposing counsel, not necessarily for them, but, to be the best public defender that I could be every day, all day. Obviously, there's times when you kind of get a little, relaxed, but, generally. And I felt like I had gotten to sort of that point where it's not really questioned, regardless of how I look, my stature, my race, what have you. And it sort of had to start all over again in some way, not just with my colleagues being, I'm the new one, I'm the green one on the bench, but I'm going to court and I'm seeing people in the gallery that are not what I'm used to seeing. Yeah, it is. It's all those things. It's all those things.
What about your relationship with your new judicial colleagues? I assume a large number of those people are people who you practiced in front of and who you knew from when you were a public defender. And I'm wondering how that relationship evolved or changed.
I mean, it's been interesting. Yes, I've tried trials in front of a good number of them. Like any workplace, I think that you make new relationships. There's perceptions that you have of each other that are debunked for good and for bad. And there's going to be people that you'll be able to become friends with, not necessarily socializing all the time, but, even people that maybe if there was a negative sort of impression of them, and then actually, hey, they're not so bad, or hopefully it's vice versa as well. I think that's happened.
What can lawyers do to be better prepared to appear in front of you as a judge?
Well, it's interesting when you say better prepared. How about just be prepared? I mean, and it could be that they feel prepared, but something as simple as knowing the timeline, the sequence of events. It seems silly, but the facts of your case. And it's not to say you didn't know them at one point, but I would imagine everyone should prepare and look in the docket and the file the night before and check in with, their client, their witnesses, or whatever the case may be. I mean, that just makes a big difference, not only to the legal system, but in front of their client. It's appalling to me to see lawyers sometimes present in the way they do when they have a client, paid or unpaid, retained or not retained, that are just not prepared. And it's just, it's shocking.
Do you think the legal system is fair?
I've seen glimpses of fairness at times, but I think, if it was fair, would we even have issues like this? Legal issues? I don't know. I think that, I'm always striving to do what I can to help it be more fair.
Let's say you came into some real money, $3 or $4 billion. What, if anything, would you do differently in your life?
I studied in advance for your questions because those are tricky. So in my life, I mean, I do want to get a condo in Hawaii. And so I probably would do that. I would spoil myself.
Which island?
Crazy. Oahu. I'm a city girl. I just like to go to the main place, and I go to Hawaii twice a year. I actually just went a couple weeks ago. And maybe get a place in San Francisco. I want there to be some sort of personal driving or shuttle service that brings kids that are from poorer neighborhoods that don't have access to a better school system or elementary, junior high, high school, and take them to other parts of the city, because a lot of poor parents, they cannot take their kids to school. And so I would like to be able to take kids from poor neighborhoods to have access to after school resources and other better schools.
Let's say you had a magic wand. There was one thing in the world that you could change, the legal world or otherwise. What would that be?
Again, I thought about this one too. I would try to level out and equalize resources and poverty in the world. You know, not just globally, but even in our own country, that it just wasn't so stark.
What about if you had 60 seconds on the Super Bowl? Really big audience, could do whatever you wanted, say whatever you wanted. What message would you put out there to that enormous audience?
I like this philosophy to myself and also when I think of others, but simply just treat others how you want to be treated, regardless of how they look, race, class, gender, sexuality, religion, just regardless of any of those things. Just treat others how you want to be treated. And I just think that's a simple way to understand and go about life.
Judge, is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we have not discussed?
So who's going to win the World Series? What's wrong with the 49ers?
I don't know if we have enough time for that.
No, I don't think so. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Judge Michelle Tong, thank you so much for joining me today on the Love Thy Lawyer podcast. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for today's episode of Love Thy Lawyer. If you enjoyed listening, please share it with a friend and follow the podcast. If you have comments or suggestions, send me an email. Take a look at our website at lovethylawyer.com, where you can find all of our episodes, transcripts, photographs, and information. Thanks to my guests, and to Joel Katz for music, Brian Matheson for technical support, Paul Roberts for social media, and Tracy Harvey. I'm Louis Goodman.
I mean, at least that was my experience. And they just complain about it. And I didn't really understand what we're doing.